Okay, hopefully we're recording. Okay, so today we're going to be going over part 2 of online radicalization. It's a series I'm doing. Today we're going to be covering the epidemic of extremism, in particular ideology and accelerationism. So to do a quick recap of part 1, we looked at modifiers and motivations. And basically, radicalization begins with modifiers, which is just a psychological, social, or situational need, which makes extremist ideas easier to absorb. And this can be anything from loneliness to frustration to whatever it is, whatever grievance. It's the thing that makes people go and seek out pretty much community, connection, right? So these vulnerabilities push individuals toward online spaces where aesthetics, memes, and communities transform raw feelings into more defined beliefs. And ideology can arrive later, which gives the community and maybe a shared grievance a name, a target, and a script for the grievances behind those communities. So, and you'll have to excuse me, my voice is going in and out. But in the previous presentation, we discussed push and pull factors, and these define what individuals do with certain emotional needs, psychological needs, situational needs, whatever it is, what they do with certain modifiers in a given situation. So external push factors like poverty, trauma, alienation, distrust, etc., make the individual more susceptible to radicalization. Whereas internal pull factors like belonging, empowerment, revenge, being inspired by charismatic leaders, etc., these factors make extremist narratives appealing once encountered. So the push factor is just when you kind of get pushed into feeling alienated and then you go seeking it, whereas internal pull factors tend to focus in on internal lack, like perceived self-lack, and looking for belonging, or seeking revenge or some sort of validation from someone you admire, etc., right? So together these forces shift someone from feeling adrift to embracing radical explanations and communities. And the path will often follow the modifier, which is the need, right? Modifier to community, community to aesthetic, aesthetic to ideology, and then ideology sometime to action. Let me see. So this trajectory can lead into broad ideological gateways, such as, we'll be looking at it, but like ethno-nationalism, religious extremism, anti-government movements, misogynistic subcultures, nihilism, occult frameworks, cyber egoism, all of these kind of things we'll look into briefly again, but also the online traits like clout-seeking, irony poisoning, victimhood identity, gamification. All of these things can amplify the process, the conveyor belt to extremism. So, and this will be down the line, but I think that the cult of 213 illustrates how many of these different elements can merge or blend into hybrid digital movements that weaponize cruelty, anonymity, and destabilization. So, online ideological extremism can be grouped into a few broad categories that describe the main currents of belief and behavior. And these aren't rigid boxes, but these groups can often overlap or borrow from each other. But the outlining some of these broader categories helps to expose a bigger, more encompassing picture. So we're just painting with a broad brush right now, just so that we can get a feel for some of the ideologies out there and what they entail. So perhaps the most familiar category is going to be political extremism, right? And this will include movements that push political ideologies to uncompromising, often violent ends. And, what comes to mind for most people is usually, the far right, ethno-nationalists, which is basically, the one that we encounter a lot in the United States, at least like in the Midwest and stuff, are like white supremacists and neo-Nazis. But there's also identitarians, accelerationists, you can get into fringe religious beliefs too. That's where it overlaps, of course. But yeah, so ethno-nationalism will often push for racial hierarchies, authoritarianism, and racial purity, or like cultural purity. And like a lot of these extremist ideologies, this does thrive online in meme culture, and especially in encrypted chat groups and in gamified propaganda. So, also, pretty identifiable, there is the far left anarchist communist type of extremism. These groups will often reject capitalism and the state entirely. And, if it gets bad, they will advocate or foment insurrection or sabotage. And this can include some strands of militant anti-fascism, right? I think President Trump just, I think he just decreed that Antifa is now a terrorist organization. So, which is, I don't even know if it's an official organization or not, so I think it's a movement, but anyway. So anti-fascism, insurrectionary anarchism, that kind of stuff. And then, sometimes you do run into like the single issue extremism, people that are like hyper-focused on ideologies tied to one political or cultural issue, like extreme anti-immigration, radical anti-globalism, or militant environmentalism, like the eco-extremists. But, I remember like a lot of, something that sticks out in my head, because I used to volunteer at an art museum, was the activists that were going in and that were gluing themselves, like super gluing themselves to famous works of art, and doing it in the name of, climate change. So, I guess it gets the attention of people, which is the point. But I don't know if that's, I guess it is extremist, right? But still, that's the one that comes to mind. But, I'm sure there are other eco-extremists that I'm not remembering, or other single issue extremism. But so political extremism is pretty much, when you think of extremism, you pretty much go here. If not to political extremism right away, then definitely religious extremism. And this is just, extremism that's driven by absolutist readings of spiritual texts or traditions, and, being an American, jihadist, Islamist extremism, growing up in the early aughts is, I'm pretty familiar with the Al-Qaeda's, then later on, like in the, 2012, 2014, ISIS and their online affiliates, heavy use of encrypted apps, like I'm sure a lot of militant groups would be using encrypted apps, propaganda videos, and online recruitment. And this was one that I hadn't really heard a lot of, but I'm sure there's something out there that would jog my memory. But Christian extremism is something militant dominionist groups. I remember apocalyptic sects, like people talking about, what was it, Heaven's Gate? But they weren't really militant about society conforming to their interpretation of Christianity. I do remember anti-abortion violence happening. I remember, doctors being killed, clinics getting blown up. I remember, during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, when young soldiers would return home deceased, there were these weird Christians that would show up and they would protest LGBTQ stuff at these soldiers' funerals. And it didn't make sense because, like, the soldiers they didn't identify as LGBTQ, but it was just a way for them to get out their message, I guess. That's something that comes to mind. And then other religiously driven extremism, cults or sects that justify violence or coercion. We're starting to hear more about these cults that are almost like, what are they, like MLMs or, the pyramid schemes stuff, where there's a lot of coercion going on, and just really weird strictness tied to, being in these hierarchies and being subservient and all of that. But so there's some examples like millenarian cults that predict doomsday stuff, anti-Semitic occult traditions, sectarian hate in regions with religious strife. So, there's a variety for everything. So we have political extremism, religious extremism, identity-based extremism. So this is going to be focused less on formal politics or religion and more on group belonging and identity. So you have something called ethno-tribalism, where these groups are defining themselves against outsiders. So I guess this can overlap with white nationalism, but I guess it also includes like black separatism or Hindu nationalism, which is really interesting. So it does feel like it's a nationalist kind of thing, but I guess it could just be like a group or culture in a society that is, more, wants to be the dominant, leader. Like I'm thinking of like, now there's Pakistan, but there's still plenty of Hindu Muslim clashes that happen along that border between India and Pakistan. So I would think there would be some radicalization there, yeah. And I wonder if it's not just tied to nationalism, but like Myanmar, where the I can't remember. I think the Buddhists came for the Muslims and did some atrocities to Muslims there. So, there's that example. Maybe like the Turks coming for the Kurds. Yeah. Anyway, so we also have incel or manosphere extremism. Communities radicalized around misogyny, blaming women or feminism for social problems, sometimes encouraging violence. We've got gender-based extremism. I remember there was right after Trump won the presidency in 2024, there was some sort of movement for females to become incels or something. I can't remember. But yeah, that could qualify. I don't know. Of course, anti-LGBTQ extremism, and I bet that overlaps with a lot of religious extremism too. The movements that demonize queer people, it starts to society. Conspiracy-based identity blends, so followers of QAnon or similar conspiracies form strong in-groups identities, with outsiders cast as dangerous others. Conspiratorial and esoteric extremism. So, yeah, not always political in the traditional sense, but radicalized through belief in secret knowledge and hidden enemies. So again, we have conspiracy extremism along with this conspiracy identity blends. A lot of this stuff is going to overlap, guys. And that's kind of why I want to show these really broad categories so that, there's no wrong answer, basically. But yeah, so conspiracy extremism like QAnon, sovereign citizens, New World Order, there was a recent one in the news, but any of these extremists that escalate to calls for violent self-defense against imagined cabals, right? You see a lot of people that are using extremist anti-Semitic rhetoric right now, and that can incite a lot of this kind of stuff. But there's also a lot of anti-Islamic rhetoric too. So anyway, it's a crazy world. So occult and esoteric extremism, groups that blend mysticism, neo-paganism, Satanism, witchcraft, ceremonial magic, blending that kind of stuff with extremist politics. And of course, Order of the Nine Angles is going to be pretty much the poster child for that, mixing occult ritual with fascism and nihilism, basically. It's nihilism. It's a better. But then this health and science extremism, I wasn't too familiar with this, except, it makes sense. Radical anti-vaxxers or anti-5G movements that adopt apocalyptic tones and sometimes engage in sabotage. So, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I know there was a fertility clinic that got blown up, and I want to say somewhere in SoCal earlier this year, and it was I think the kid, it was a young kid that went and did it, and he was anti people being born. He was an anti-natalist. So there's literally something for everyone, guys. Not saying that you should go find anything. I'm not saying that. And this is just the Adam Waffen division flag, which could be considered occult esoteric extremist. So another broad category is this hybrid and post-ideological extremism. So it's kind of a pick and mix. You get to basically pick and mix. So I don't know. So accelerationism to me feels like it's in a lot of these extremist ideologies. And if it's post-ideological, I don't even know, because it's just like, the belief that society should be destabilized quickly to rebuild a new order. And it's basically just this promotion of extreme nihilism, apolitical nihilism, like the world is absurd and shitty and we should just fucking burn it down, kind of stuff, right? That's accelerationism. You get the gamified extremism. I would call this more of a trait because it shows up in so many places, but I guess there are these online subcultures that treat real world violence like a competitive game. The way that some people celebrated Charlie Kirk getting assassinated felt almost gamified in that it was trending, so it was like everybody was building off of each other's content. And then also it was like who can be more outlandish, who can get like the most likes or retweets or shares or whatever, just kind of that kind of gamifiedness of it all. And then networked extremism is a decentralized movement, and like Anonymous or Boogaloo, that thrive on shared memes and aesthetics rather than fixed doctrine. But decentralized is the key component here, and I think that is a major aspect of the cult of 213 when we finally get to it. So the final large category here of online extreme ideology is state-sponsored or proxy extremism. And this can be extremist content and networks which are deliberately cultivated by governments. And I'm sure all of you have heard that like Reddit and 4chan are basically run by the feds, right? That's the rumor on the street. I don't know. But, it's a great place to put out information warfare, troll farms, because there's literally troll farms, botnets, psyops, designed to radicalize or destabilize opponents. So, there were a lot of militia groups that went to January 6th, but, a lot of that stuff probably started online, possibly by the FBI, to give them a reason to make themselves more insidious and have more access and more powers to the American people and to infringe upon our rights in a sense. But of course, I think Glenn Greenwald did some good reporting on that, and I find it convincing. I don't think it's tinfoil necessarily. And I think the Gretchen Whitmer, assassination plot was also very pre-planned and orchestrated to, again, kind of set up extremists so that the FBI could be like, oh, see, we need to have more overseeing abilities to monitor all of you dangerous folk. So, but, government's gonna government, I guess. So, proxy militias, groups supported financially or ideologically by states but acting online as grassroots. I would also say probably take into consideration billionaires too. Millionaires and billionaires that get supported financially. Maybe even like, what do you call it? The dark money kind of stuff too, where it's like it's supposed to just be grassroots, but so those are the six big ones. So political extremism, religious extremism, identity-based extremism, conspiratorial and esoteric extremism, hybrid and post-ideological extremism. I feel like this is a lot of just like traits, online traits, and like philosophy, and then state-sponsored or proxy extremism. So we just need to remember that online extremism is less about clean ideological boundaries and more about network effects, like shared memes, symbols, stories, narratives that make radical worldviews feel accessible, entertaining, and true. So what starts as political, religious, or identity-driven often blends into conspiratorial and hybrid forms anyway, especially in digital environments where there's, you have all of these different traits of irony, humor, gamification, cloudism, etc., etc. All of these are tools of radicalization. So, I don't know if I want to read all of this. My voice is already kind of going, but on the 6th of March, 2025, the FBI put out this public service announcement, and they were basically warning that there are violent online networks that target vulnerable and underage populations across the United States and the globe. So they were noticing a sharp increase in the activity of 764 and other violent online networks. So, and there could be infinite numbers of these types of groups, all with like little, different variations, but basically coming to the same thing, driving people to violence. So these networks methodically target and exploit minors and other vulnerable individuals. It's imperative the public be made aware of the risk and the warning signs exhibited by victims. These networks use threat, blackmail, and manipulation to coerce or extort victims into producing, sharing, or live streaming acts of self-harm, animal cruelty, sexually explicit acts, and or suicide. The footage is then circulated among members of the network to continue to extort victims and exert control over them. So, disaffected youth produces more disaffected youth. Hurt people hurt people. So, some of the violent actors in these online networks are motivated by a desire to cause fear and chaos through their criminal conduct. But motivations are highly individualized. Again, that's why we can't get into rigid thinking, or like it has to just be within this rigid ideological category. We have to keep an open mind. So some threat actors may be engaging in criminal activity solely for sexual gratification, social status, or a sense of belonging, or for a mix of other reasons that may not be ideologically motivated, right? So these networks exist on publicly available online platforms such as social media sites, gaming platforms, mobile applications, commonly used by young people. And of course, like, there's that common phrase or the common saying where it's like, don't let them take you to a second location. That goes for online platforms as well. So many threat actors systematically target underage females, but anyone, juveniles, adults, males, females, anyone can be targeted. Victims are typically between the ages of 10 and 17, but the FBI has seen some victims as young as 9. I'm sure there's worse, but that's still terrible. But these violent actors target vulnerable populations to include children, as well as those who struggle with a variety of mental health issues, such as depression, eating disorders, or suicidal ideation. And, hence why we might be seeing more trans people getting sucked into, violent acts, because they are some of the most vulnerable people in our society. So, threat actors often groom their victims by first establishing a trusting or romantic relationship before eventually manipulating and coercing them into engaging in escalating harmful behavior designed to shame and isolate. The networks use extortion and blackmail tactics, such as threatening to swat or dox their victims if the victims do not comply with the network's demands. The actors can manipulate or coerce victims to produce child sexual abuse material, CSAM, and other videos depicting animal cruelty and self-harm. Self-harm activity can include cutting, stabbing, or fan signing. It's basically like branding or carving a bad actor, an abusive person's the username or whatever it is into like the skin. Members of the networks threaten to share the explicit videos or photos of the victims with the victim's family, friends, or post the photos and videos to the internet. The networks control their victims through extreme fear, and many members have an end goal of forcing the victims they extort or coerce to live stream their own suicide for the network's entertainment or the threat actor's own sense of fame. So the FBI urges the public to exercise increased vigilance when posting personal photos, videos, or personal identifying information or direct messaging online. Although seemingly innocuous when posted or shared, the images and videos can provide malicious actors an abundant supply of content to exploit and manipulate or alter for criminal activity. Victims are vulnerable to embarrassment, harassment, extortion, or continued long-term re-victimization. The FBI recommends looking for warning signs indicating a victim may be engaging in self-harm or having suicidal thoughts. So, they recommend that family, friends, and associates consider the following potential indicators and warning signs. So, sudden behavior changes, becoming withdrawn, moody, or irritable. Sudden changes in appearance, especially neglect of appearance. Changes in eating or sleeping habits. Dropping out of activities, becoming more isolated and withdrawn. The talk of like a new online friend or network or friend group, and displaying infatuation with and or fear of that friend or network or friend group. Receipt of anonymous gifts, items delivered to the home, currency, gaming currency, or other virtual items. Scars, often in patterns, fresh cuts, scratches, bruises, bite marks, burns, or other wounds. Carvings, such as words or symbols on the skin. Wearing long sleeves or pants, especially in hot weather. Writing in blood or what appears to be blood. Threatening suicide. Openly talking of death. Being unwanted or not being around. Idealization of mass shooting or mass casualty events. Family pets or other animals being harmed or dying under suspicious circumstances. Family pets uncharacteristically avoid and or fearful of your child or you. Law enforcement called to the home under false pretenses, swatting or doxing by an unknown person. So, the FBI recommends the public consider the following when sharing content, like videos and photos, or engaging with individuals online. You're going to want to monitor children's and other vulnerable individuals' online activity and discuss risks associated with sharing personal information. And of course, use discretion when posting images, videos, and other personal content online, particularly those that include children or their information. So, Yeah, in recent years, the FBI and other intelligence agencies have expressed growing concern about extremist ideologies that thrive in digital spaces, particularly those rooted in accelerationist philosophy. So, accelerationism, in its extremist form, is a mindset, a psychological orientation, and increasingly a viral framework used to justify violence. Understanding the psychology behind this philosophy is crucial to addressing why it continues to gain ground, especially among vulnerable online communities. So, what's accelerationism? It's a radical political theory that advocates for hastening the collapse of current systems, social, political, or economic, believing that chaos or systemic breakdown will trigger revolutionary change. In extremist contexts, it often translates into promoting or committing violence to accelerate societal decay and provoke authoritarian backlash or civil conflict. It's a belief that the faster society descends into chaos, the sooner a revolutionary new order can emerge. Accelerationist and extremist spaces deliberately incite violence to destabilize governments and ignite civil conflict. So it's basically the belief that societal collapse should not only be accepted, but actively pushed forward in order to rebuild something new. Often envisioned as a utopian or purified state by its adherents. In extremist circles, this philosophy is harnessed to justify acts of terror, sabotage, and violence as tools to bring about the end of liberal democracy, multiculturalism, or other perceived societal ills. It's not confined to one political ideology. Both far-right and far-left variants exist. And, here it says, though the most lethal forms in recent history have been tied to white supremacist accelerationism, I guess if you're considering like the Christchurch shooting, yeah, I think it's actually pervasive everywhere, and we'll see more of it. So, a crisis of meaning. So, accelerationism is philosophically rooted in nihilism, and a lot of people attribute nihilism to Friedrich Nietzsche, but it was actually first coined by this Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi. And nihilism is the belief that life lacks inherent meaning, value, or purpose. It is a rejection of arbitrary and meaningless moral principles, religious beliefs, or social structures. Many accelerationists view the existing world order as irredeemably corrupt, fake, or broken. The draw of accelerationism is both ideological and emotional. This worldview is often accompanied by a sense of disillusionment, alienation, loneliness, powerlessness, or despair. Feelings that are especially common in younger individuals navigating existential anxieties, social fragmentation, disconnection, and perceived moral decline. Accelerationism sells the fantasy of purpose through destruction, especially during times of institutional instability when progressive gains feel hollow. So, accelerationist ideologies seek to control chaotic feelings by inflicting pain born of the inner world onto the outer world. This inner self-loathing gets inflicted onto the outer world as an apocalyptic cleansing. Tapping into this human attraction of purity and rebirth, things that are embedded in myth, religion, psychology. It's this idea of success through demolition or desecration, but it's playing off of our baser instincts. Because it's always easier to destroy something than it is to build it up. But for those struggling with despair, accelerationism may feel like a shortcut to significance, offering identity, purpose, and belonging, especially in online spaces where real-world consequences are initially abstract. For some, it may provide a sense of agency. Digital life blurs the line between fantasy and reality, allowing a desensitizing creep where violence is common or normalized. The internet is a proving ground for radical beliefs and a place where violent fantasy can be incubated without immediate judgment or restraint. Accelerationism is both a dangerous ideology and a psychological trap. It thrives in discontent, feeds on digital anonymity, and mass nihilism as revolution. So, to counter it, we must not only monitor violent rhetoric, but also address the deeper emotional wounds and societal failures that drive people toward it in the first place. Understanding the why is our first step toward prevention. So, social fragmentation. Social fragmentation is a term used in sociology to describe the breakdown of shared norms, trust, and cohesion in a society. Why do so many people lament the 1950s America? I would hope not for the racism or sexism or lack of multiculturalism and a whole bunch of other stuff, but I think people liked the idea of a homogenous society that believed in similar values. Like, you looked over at your neighbor and you're like, yeah, he's a Christian, because everybody's Christian, you know, and no hate on Christians or anything, but I'm just saying that, like, you could look around, people looked like you, and people believed the same things that you did. At least, I think that's where they are getting, I don't know if it's like a nostalgia or what, but it's an idealized belief that, we can't go back, but we're certainly far from being unified, right? So, over the past decades, accelerationism has gained traction online because it resonates with a growing sense that society itself is unraveling. We have economic precarity, political polarization, institutional distrust, and disorienting speed of technological change. And all of this stuff has eroded traditional sources of stability and belonging, right? And these aren't little things. These are like, these are like the pillars of society, right? So, in this environment, the idea that collapse is not only inevitable but desirable becomes appealing to disaffected groups who feel powerless or betrayed. Online spaces amplify this trend. Memes and digital aesthetics turn chaos into something that feels exciting, even playful, while forums and subcultures normalize the belief that destroying the system is easier than fixing it. And this convergence of historical stressors and digital culture has made accelerationism one of the fastest spreading grooming tools in radical online movements. So, accelerationism and the internet. Why the internet fuels it. Accelerationism can exist offline, but its viral nature is fundamentally tied to online culture because of the immediacy of being able to spread it. Digital platforms, especially anonymous forums and encrypted channels, provide fertile ground for radicalization through mimetic warfare, violent ideologies disguised as jokes, memes, edgy humor, making them more palatable and shareable, gamification of ideology, points, badges, kill counts from violent manifestos, mimic video game logic, appealing to impressionable minds, algorithmic echo chambers, recommendation systems feed users increasingly extreme content, reinforcing their worldview, anonymity and identity play, the ability to explore radical identities without real-world accountability, lowers the psychological cost of extremism. So the online world offers community, creating niche spaces for radical accelerationist groups to cultivate in-groups that validate grievances and celebrate commitment to the cause, sometimes even martyring those who carry out violent acts. Can it exist outside the internet? While accelerationist ideas have existed in fringe literature and revolutionary movements long before the digital age, their current influence is deeply symbiotic with online culture. Offline, such ideas require more effort to spread, greater risk to endorse, and less access to feedback loops of validation. However, this doesn't mean accelerationism can't jump from screen to street. It already has, basically, yeah. Events like the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand, the Buffalo supermarket attack, and others were not just inspired by online content, they were designed to become online content. Killers live streamed their attacks or left manifestos filled with internet references, memes, and codes, transforming violence into viral propaganda for a digital army they've never met. So, I did want to clarify that I believe that whether the extremist ideology is political or not shouldn't matter as far as it being labeled as terrorism. So, why online extremism qualifies as terrorism? Terrorism is typically defined as violence or the threat of violence carried out to advance a political, religious, or ideological goal. The legal and academic definitions often emphasize the need for a political grievance or political intent, but what we're observing online fits into an emerging reality. Extremist movements may clock themselves in irony, nihilism, or apolitical chaos, yet their actions still have profound political consequences which reshape public safety, governance, and community life. Impact on collective life. Even when framed as just trolling or just memes, these acts escalate into targeted harassment, intimidation, doxing, swatting, and violence that directly shape how people communicate, organize, and trust one another. And that's inherently political. It influences the rules and norms of how we live together, right? Grievance as a pretext. So whether it's accelerationism, misogyny, white supremacy, anti-system nihilism, etc., these ideologies create grievances against perceived enemies, like the state or women, minorities, institutions, whatever. They may look fragmented, but they still channel rage toward altering power relations, blurring political boundaries. Terrorism doesn't have to map neatly onto traditional left or right politics. Extremist online subcultures manufacture meta-politics by destabilizing consensus itself. If politics is about negotiating how we live together, then destabilization is a political act, right? Coercion through fear. Domestic extremists online often aim to intimidate journalists, activists, or communities into silence. That coercion is terrorism, even if expressed aesthetically rather than through manifestos. Online radicalization and extremist ideology should be treated as terrorism. Even if the perpetrators deny having a clear political program, their actions seek to reshape communal life through intimidation, destabilization, and fear. And that qualifies as political violence, and thus terrorism, under both the spirit and the letter of most definitions. So I do want to say that the tactics that have been used in the online true crime community, particularly Delphi, I qualify it as terrorism, especially looking at it through the lens of these definitions. So, yeah. This is becoming more common. This is a real thing. And it affects real people. And real people are behind it. And that's crazy. Because something crazy has been happening to society. And it didn't happen overnight. But the bigger issue is to be aware of it and to call it out when you see it so you know what's happening, and to see if something can be done about it. And yeah, so that is part 2, and I hope to have part 3 out sometime soonish. That should be aesthetics, maybe some more definitions of stuff, maybe meme culture stuff. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. I always forget to say this, but yeah, I do talk slow. So yeah, feel free to do this on 1.25 speed. Oh my god. Now that you've finished it. But yeah, please leave a like, subscribe if you aren't, and get out the good word, people, because this shit's real, and it's scary, and it's not going away. But yeah, that's about it. I hope to talk to you guys soon. Have a good day or evening or whatever.